Chronicles of the War of Souls book series. Book 1 Lirael, The Beginning of the End. Chapter 25, Wings of Hope. For the next several weeks, Landorn ceased to be a wounded sanctuary of sorrow. It transformed into a giant, humming hive, where every whirl of bark on the ancient oaks, every rustle of leaves in the upper canopy, every ray of light piercing the once peaceful vaults, was now subjugated to a single, iron purpose war. The silence, accumulated over centuries in these arches like old honey in combs, was swept utterly clean. Beneath the sacred boughs, where once only reverent quiet and the whispers of prayer held sway, now stood the continuous, deafening clang and thud of a mechanical heartbeat, a waking giant's pulse. The north meadow swiftly grew over with the sharp, ruthless geometry of a military camp. Rows of identical tents made from coarse, dust and sweat-smelling canvas stood with a straightness unnatural to the forest. Between them stood massive wagons with wheels still damp from rain, and beside them forges not the cozy ones that shaped jewelry or sickles, but low, smoky dens from which billowed not wisps of soot but a steady, searing heat that roared out with every gasp of the bellows. The air thrummed with 1,000 voices, intertwining into a solid roar. Sharp commands, arguments, the clatter of armor being unpacked from crates, the screech of wheels over hardened mud, and the measured, endless hammer strike on anvils like a countdown for the last seconds of peace. The elves, whose movements for ages had been devoid of hurry and akin to the flow of a deep river, now moved with quick, purposeful strides, the folds of their garments not flowing but snapping sharply behind them. On their beautiful, ageless faces, alongside the ancient sorrow, appeared a new expression, acute, almost painful, focused resolve. This was not the hot rage of men drunk on blood, nor the blind ferocity of orcs, but the cold, honed, blade-like will of a race that in one instant had understood with its entire long existence that its endless time had suddenly run out, and the hourglass had been overturned. Lirael and her company, though living heroes to all who had returned the ghost of hope to Landorn, knew not a single hour of peace. They were assailed with questions like a hail of arrows, commanders of forming squads with worry etched at their eyes, master armors with fingers perpetually black from soot, cartographers whose fine quills scratched across parchment, laying the foundation for future campaign plans. Every moment of their eastern journey, every pass mantled in eternal snow, every tuft of dry grass on the imperial plains, every low arch of the under-mountain kingdom, where the air smelled of damp and ire, was probed in minute detail, meticulously recorded, analyzed by cold intellect. Aelor, silent and immovable as a crag, became a living, breathing textbook on tactics against goblin hordes and the stone-crushing power of trolls. He moved pieces of bread on a table to depict maneuvers, his low voice, monotone and hard, describing precisely how a troll's club strikes, the whistle as it cleaves the air, the crunch of bone giving way. Orlin, with his hawk-sharp eyes, spent days and nights bent over spread-out maps marked with alarming symbols. He guided a thin stylus along the contours of mountain ridges, pointing to narrow ravines where the wind wailed particularly mournfully possible ambush sites for the winged and bloodthirsty harpies whose shadows flitted through his memory. Lirael and Iviel, speaking few words, helped organize field hospitals, passing on to elven healers the bitter, hard-won experience of tending wounded in field conditions, where filth and despair were the deadliest foes. And at the center of this bustling, noisy activity, in a quiet, urban illness-scented tent converted into an infirmary, its own invisible yet no less fierce battle raged, under the unceasing, gentle, but steel-firm guidance of Iviel, whose eyes still held the deep shadows of exhaustion like bruises, yet burned with an inner, indomitable fire of purpose. The body of Talos, gaunt and pale, slowly, with immense effort, returned to life, the sinister crimson scar on his pale, almost translucent skin, marking the side of the open, bone-shattering fracture. Under the influence of thick elven healing salves brewed from herbs that glow under the moon, tailed day by day, tightened, turning from a flaming brand into a pink, still ugly trace. One morning, when dew still silvered the tent canvas, he, gritting his teeth against pain like a red-hot nail in his flesh, leaning on his staff, managed to rise from his camp, caught a simple board covered by a thin blanket. The ashwood of the staff seemed to pulse a little brighter in his weak hand, feeding on the returning, sap-like strength of its master. He limped, each step echoing dully his bones. This scar was the eternal monument to their mission, the immutable price paid to the sky. But in his eyes, deep and colored like forest lakes at sunset, that same analytical, calm, and relentless fire was rekindling the fire that saw the essence of things through any veil. It was he who, one day, as Lirael and Quendelern once more wrestled with the seemingly unsolvable problem of a voice for the hawks, suggested a simple solution, soft as the rustle of a fallen leaf. "They hear not with ears," he whispered, his thin, tail fingers squeezing the crystal of his staff until the knuckles whitened. In response, it pulsed with a dim but living green light, like a distant star. "They feel with skin, with bone, with feather, vibrations, rhythm, frequency. Their hum is not a cry, is a resonance with the pure, untainted atmosphere of the high sky. We need not the voice of a singer, however fair, but the voice of the earth, of the forest itself, its roar." He looked at Quendelern, and between the keeper of ancient, book-bound wisdom inscribed on scrolls and the keeper of natural, wild rhythms that beat in the heart of every living thing, a silent but strong thread of understanding ran, akin to that which connects the roots of trees, a single network beneath dark soil. "The white tree," the high priest said slowly, with deliberation, as if weighing each word. His voice held an echo of ancient dread and hope. "Its roots reach into the very heart of the world, into dark strata, where primordial forces sleep. Its pain is our shared pain. Its call, if we can wake it, could be heard even there." The plan was born then and there, in the stifling quiet of the tent, beneath the unceasing drone of the camp, like the breathing of a slumbering beast. They would awaken not a magic of illusions, deceptive and fragile, but a magic of resonance, severe and immutable, as the law of gravity, using Tylos crystal as a tuning fork for the world's string, and the united, hardened will of all elves of Landorn and the druids of the eternal forest as a giant amplifier. They would make the ancient trunk of the white tree itself vibrate, shake the earth beneath it to its foundations, sending into the sky an inaudible but tangible low-frequency wave, a tremor, a call wrenched from the very flesh, the very bones of the world, a call of suffering and wrath. But all their plans, all their meticulous calculations, all this urgent, feverish preparation already tinged with the gleam of a coming victory were delivered a terrible, final, and merciless verdict by fate itself. The eastern sky, which for many days had smoldered with a sinister, sickly crimson glow that even the fiercest autumn winds could not dispel, suddenly, in one instant was slit open, as a knife guts a fish. First, the air shuddered, not from sound, but from pressure, a heavy, thick, physical blow to the chest of every living creature, from which tears sprang and bitten to many elven eyes, and a ringing, deafening vacuum filled their ears, sucking out all other noise. The birds, grown used to the constant camp noise, fell silent as one, and this silence was more terrible than any scream. Then came the light, not a flash, blinding and fast, but a slow, inexorable manifestation, like the rise of a monstrous sun, from beyond the distant, mist-shrouded peaks of the dragon's spine. From that cursed, poisoned southeast, a colossal pillar of light reared, arched, and pierced the very heavens, rending the clouds. This was not the light of fire, not pure lightning. It was concentrated, poisonous light, unbearable to a living gaze, the color of clotted, old blood and metal melted in a hellish forge, a light promising nothing but annihilation. A crimson beam, it pierced the sky, and the world froze, holding its breath before the inevitable. It stood motionless, skewering the low, dirty clouds like a giant spear driven by a titan into the very heart of a still living world. And this one did not bleed but glowed with a poisonous, unearthly radiance. The air filled with a silence, not the peaceful, soothing silence of a forest at dawn, but an oppressive, ringing in the ears, absolute silence that falls in the instant before thunderclap, a silence more dreadful than any roar, for it heralded a roar capable of splitting the very earth. In the camp, which moments before had hummed like a stirred anthill, everything froze instantly. Smiths dropped their hammers, which thudded dully on anvils, the last sound swallowed by the ensuing hush. Warriors stood stock still, staring at the sky, their faces, just moments ago worried or determined, now twisted by primitive, animal terror and awestruck awe before a power surpassing all reason, all courage. This was no natural phenomenon, no storm or eruption. It was an omen made manifest, a visible, physical incarnation of pure, insane, all-consuming hatred, without cause or need for explanation. A declaration of war not merely upon armies or cities, but upon the very order of being, upon the light of day and the breath of life. Lirael stepped from her tent, pushing aside the flap, and, without taking her eyes from that bloody beacon of doom, whose reflection cast a crimson pall over everything, felt the last of her doubts fall away, and cold, Unerring steel closed definitively around her heart. All the searches through foreign lands, all the treaties sealed, all this hasty, feverish preparation, it had all been one great race. A race against the end of the world, which had been creeping closer and now revealed its face. And now the finish line of that race was set ablaze by that smoking, incredible fuse leading to a giant powder keg where instead of saltpeter was packed depressed dust of worlds. Her thoughts raced with icy, searing speed, forming a clear, relentless chain. This is the signal. Not a probe, not a threat, the start of the general, total offensive. And the first, primary target will be Nar-Uzdum-Arak, their last stronghold. They no longer had months for gathering and training. Not weeks for long marches. They had days, perhaps hours. And every one of those moments was worth pure mithril. She turned, and her gaze met that of Gwendolyn standing beside her. He was pale as a sail before a storm, but impossibly calm, a calmness stronger than any armor. His old eyes, fixed on the fading yet still hanging beam in the celestial heights, were devoid of mortal terror. In them was only the bottomless, all-comprehending sorrow of a sage who has seen the circles of the cosmos, and a quiet, bitter acceptance of the inevitable. Father. Lirael's voice was level, firm, without a hint of hesitation, like a blade striking stone. We march, now. The camp is not yet ready for a full march, he said quietly, not as an objection, but as a calm statement of a hard fact to be accepted and overcome. It is as ready as it can be in the face of that. She nodded towards the east, where the sky still bore the crimson stain. The Griffins await our call at their crags, but they will not wait forever. Messengers must be sent to them now, on hippogriffs, so word reaches them in time. The hawks must be summoned now, so they can gather and fly to the rally point. Delay is death. Gwendolyn slowly, heavily nodded, and in that nod was the agreement not only of a commander, but of a priest blessing his host on a path from which many would not return. Give the order to break camp. The druids and I will begin the ritual at the tree at first dusk. We will find that voice that can cry out to the skyborn creatures. And in the camp, as if by the wave of an unseen hand, there rose not panic, not blind flight, but a feverish, automatonic activity of the final hour before battle. Orders, delivered in hoarse but firm voices, swept through the rows of tents like wind over steppe. Warriors, now almost fully clad in armor polished to a shine, began forming into columns, their faces set in stone masks awaiting further command. Supply wagons, not yet fully packed, were hastily loaded with sacks of dried provisions, water casks, and crates of arrows, whose clatter and rattle now sounded like martial music. The air held not just a sense of hurry, but a sharp, almost metallic, nerve-tingling feel of a point of no return, which they had all collectively crossed. Iviel, having finished the last, most essential preparations in the field infirmary, now ordered with strict efficiency, approached Talos. He stood leaning on his staff, his gaze full of inhuman concentration fixed on the point on the horizon, where the crimson pillar had already melted, leaving behind only a dark, sinister afterglow like the inside of a giant, superheated furnace. "Are you certain you can endure this?" she asked, and her usually firm voice wavered, betraying the depth of the worry she so carefully hid from all. "I must," he replied calmly, not looking away. His limping leg caused almost no gnawing pain now, but that was nothing, an empty space, compared to the icy burn that unearthly light on the horizon had left in his soul. The crystal and the staff it remembers the frequency of their hum, as a string remembers the sound of a tuning fork. I can transmit that memory to the tree, tune its ancient flesh to the required vibration. That is all that is required of me. Meanwhile, at the very edge of the camp where the grass gave way to wild forest, Lirael found the leader of the hippogriffs. The immense bird beast, armored in feathers shining like scales, seemed also to contemplate the east in silence, its golden, intelligent eyes narrowed to slits, catching distant, invisible sense of danger. "You must fly," said Lirael, placing her palm on his powerful, warm neck where beneath the skin pulsed a strong, steady life. "Fly to the Griffins, straight to their lairs in the gray peaks. Take with you your fastest and hardiest, let your flock be both escort and proof of our word's seriousness." She peered into the depths of his pupil, trying to imbue her gaze with all the force of command and the weight of trust. "Tell their lord of the crags, tell him thus. The muster is called. The time for promised aid has come. The crimson beam is the signal we feared. We march now, with all our strength, to the eastern passes of the dragon's spine. We will be there in 3 days. Await us there. that together we may begin the airlift. Meet us at the Black Pass, and guide our troops through your aerial realm, as agreed. The leader, this majestic creature, slowly, with understanding worthy of a sentient being, bowed its eagle head. The deep, penetrating look it bestowed upon Lirael was more eloquent than any oath sworn in ancient taunts. It gave a low, guttural, yet far-carrying cry, and its kin, stationed at the camp's edges, answered in kind, gathering around itself the 5 swiftest and sturdiest hippogriffs. It did not simply take flight, it led a small, swift cadre of aerial messengers whose mission was vital. With a powerful, air-filling thunderclap of huge wings, they tore away from the trampled, wounded earth of the North Meadow and set a course not directly east towards the dragon's spine, but south, to the grim, snow-capped peaks of the Grey Peaks, following a path they had once already forged. They carried not a request, but an urgent, brooking no delay dispatch and summons to muster. The allies must move immediately and come to the appointed rendezvous to fulfill their part of the pact to become the living, mighty aerial bridge for the entire elven army. In the very heart of the sacred grove, at the foot of the white tree whose great crack seemed to pulse to something ancient and terrible, a quiet, focused circle was already gathering. Gwendolyn, Talos with his staff, the druids of the eternal forest sent long ago by the Council of 12, the elder elves of Landorn. Their faces in the gathering dusk were serious and inscrutable as the faces of stone idols. The most desperate, most audacious ritual in the long history of their people was beginning, not a quiet prayer for salvation or harvest, but a thunderous call to war, struck like sparks of wool from the very heart of their world. A call not to close combat, but to distant, proud allies. A summons that must cut through hundreds of miles of fog, wind, and cloud and say to the wild, free hawks of the misty lowlands, whose eyes had seen the birth of rivers, your hour has come, come. Take upon your wings the weight of our war and bear it over the mountains. The crimson beam had long since faded, dissolving into the gathering dark, thus beginning the count of the last, swiftly flowing hours of the old, familiar world. And Landorn, gathering all its ancient, age-old will into one steel, unbending fist, took the first, irrevocable step towards its terrible, bloody dawn. The first, vanguard column of elven warriors, armor gleaming with the last light, led by the implacable Lirael and the keen-eyed Orlin, was already on the move, setting a firm course northeast to the foothills of the Dragon's Spine, towards a place where, if the gods were merciful, the true lords of the sky, the Griffins, should be waiting for them. And above this steel-ordered stream of bows and spears, beneath a low, leaden-heavy sky, a majestic, living aerial tapestry began to unfold. The free flocks of hippogriffs, heeding their leader's call, became a celestial escort, an honor guard for the elven host. There were hundreds of them, bronze, copper, gray steel silhouettes gliding through the pre-evening air with a stately, almost ritual grace. They did not fuss, did not dart in search of prey. Their flight embodied a focused, grim calm before the storm. They held wide, smooth circles at medium altitude, their mighty wings almost soundless in their sweep, only occasionally rustling as they cut the damp, cold air, a sound like banners fluttering over an army fading into twilight. The wedges and cascades of hippogriffs shifted softly, almost fluidly, rearranging their patterns in the sky as the column on the ground changed direction due to a ravine, or slowed on a steep climb. Their keen, amber eyes, capable of spotting a scurrying mouse a mile away, ceaselessly, methodically scanned the horizon. But this was no watch born of fear, it was the watch of confident, predatory strength. When the lead hippogriff in one of the high flocks noticed ahead, around a bend in the trail, a steep rocky ascent, a dangerous scree, or a narrow, tight spot in a ravine among ancient, close-knit crowns, it did not utter an alarm cry. It simply altered its flight trajectory slightly, carving a smooth arc in the air. And this maneuver, like a wave through water, passed to all its kin in the air, and then through a series of barely perceptible, calm signals conveyed by the set of their wings to the elf commanders on the ground. They, in turn, raised a hand or gave a short whistle, and the column's route was adjusted beforehand, without fuss, without needless, strength-sapping words. Thus the hippogriffs became a living, thinking map and a silent, instant communication system, their shadows sliding over the ground, their very presence looming over the army not as a threat, but as a winged, unshakable order, granting a strange comfort. Beside the squad commanders marched or sat quietly on creaking wagons, the druids of the eternal forest. There were few of them, just a pair, rarely three, per entire company, in their simple, worn garments the color of raw earth and old bark, with staffs of living, still breathing wood. There was nothing of a warrior's bearing, but their calm was of a different, special kind, deep-rooted, like the peace of an old, unhurried forest. They walked, sometimes lightly touching the trunks of roadside trees with their palms, as if greeting old acquaintances or drawing quiet strength from them. They did not fight the mounting weariness of the warriors. With magic spells they gently, almost imperceptibly diverted it aside, like a stubborn stream patiently flowing around a boulder without breaking it. Their quiet yet palpable presence created small islands of imperturbable, ancient strength where the feverish haste and oppressive burden of what lay ahead receded slightly, yielding to a clear, mindful, step-by-step movement forward, without a word. They reminded those marching that the earth beneath their weary feet was still alive, still breathing, and remembered its children, even as they left its very heart to meet the darkness. In the abandoned Landorn, in the heart of the sacred grove by the white tree, what needed to be done had been done, and the silence after the deed was more eloquent than any din. The circle had dispersed, its heavy, focused work complete. Gwendolyn seemed to have grown even deeper into the damp earth at the foot of the giant tree. His face beneath the silver of his hair was pale as ash, but utterly calm, expressing only the profoundest weariness of a sage who had fulfilled his duty. Talos, leaning heavily on his staff in which the crystal now glowed with a steady, weary, muted green light, quietly caught his breath, his chest rising and falling slowly and with effort. No more trembling in the earth underfoot, no hum vibrating in the air and bones, only a quiet, almost ghostly sensation of a vast released force, a residual vibration like the long, fading ring in a huge, ancient bell after the final, deafening strike. The call had been sent. It was not a furious cry, not a distress signal, but a precise, calibrated, resonating impulse woven into the very fabric of world frequencies, into the tissue of reality that lies beneath sound and light. It was already racing, invisible and unstoppable, southwards, to the misty, damp expanses of the Misty Lowlands, carrying within itself a simple and clear, heartbeat-like message. The time has come. Appear. At that same time, in another place, over the harsh gray peaks, a different messenger appeared. He and his companions were admitted to the very lair without hindrance, as trusted allies. The small cadre escorted respectfully to the crag where their leader dwelt. The hippogriffs appeared before the jagged peak of the Lord, not as supplicants begging for aid, but as envoys performing a heavy and honorable duty. They held a long, dignified pause at a respectful distance, hovering on powerful wings, until from the dark, cave-like nest arose the immense, dark gray stone figure of the Lord of the Crags himself. His emergence onto the ledge was like the sudden growth of a new, living cliff, and the air itself seemed to thicken with his presence. Then the hippogriff leader began his silent, yet utterly clear report. It uttered not a single anxious or hurried sound. Instead, it performed a complex, precise, military drill-like sequence of movements, slow, stately circles denoting the long journey from Landorn, a sharp, short wingbeat unmistakably pointing east, towards the smoldering thread, a proud, straight, purposeful forward flight symbolizing the unstoppable movement of the entire elven army, and finally a deep, respectful bow of its entire body towards the peak, signifying expectation and readiness. All this was accompanied by its firm, calm, open gaze, unwaveringly fixed upon the Lord. It conveyed not panic, but a solemn and inexorable summons to begin the long-agreed-upon action. The Lord of the Crags watched, motionless and silent as the mountain from which he seemed born. His eyes, the color of gold molten in a crucible, absorbed every gesture, every turn of wing. When the hippogriff fell silent, hanging in the air like a statue, the silence between them grew thick, heavy, and immensely significant. Then the Lord slowly, with stone-like inevitability, nodded, once. This was not merely a reply to a messenger. It was an order issued by his entire being, an order immediately felt by all his grim, disciplined flock. Following that nod, a sound erupted from his deep, powerful chest, a low, bass, drawn-out hum like the grinding of tectonic plates shifting in the world's depths. It was not a furious battle roar. It was a call, a signal for mobilization, immediate and total, understood by every griffin, young and old. For many miles around, a sound that made dust tremble on the rocks, and across the entire massif of the gray peaks, a slow but absolutely inexorable movement began. Like the awakening of a great mechanism, from deep fissures, narrow ledges, platforms invisible from the ground, one after another, without haste, appeared mighty winged figures with beaks like curved daggers. They flew out in silence, with the same stately, predatory confidence with which a mountain range itself stretches at dawn. They gathered in the cold, thin air, forming ever more impressive and disciplined groupings, each around its own leader, smaller in stature, but no lesser in fury. They now awaited only the full muster, the last brief preparations, to surge forth to the promised meeting, down by word and duty. Meanwhile, in Landorn, abandoned and empty, an unfamiliar, almost ringing silence reigned. Contrasting with the recent clamor, the sacred grove was deserted. Only the wind rustled in the leaves of the white tree. The north meadow was now but a sad field dotted with traces of the recent camp trampled. Brown grass, black, wet circles from campfires, forgotten pegs jutting from the earth, frayed rope ends. The last, heaviest wagons with rear supplies had long since vanished into the eastern forest thicket, and the ruts from their wheels led to where all the life of this place had gone. At the foot of the white tree, as its final sentinels, only two remained. Quendelern seemed to have become an inseparable part of it, immobile, ancient as the roots delving into the depths of ages. His gaze was turned not outward, but inward, listening to the fading echo of the departed army. The quiet, barely perceptible response of the earth to thousands of receding footsteps. Beside him, leaning heavily on his staff, stood Talos. His limping leg caused almost no physical pain now, but he felt a different, far deeper exhaustion, magical, spiritual, the depletion after the summoning ritual that had drawn out the strength only just beginning to return. They were like two last autumn leaves lingering on a bare branch before a long, harsh winter, whose coming they themselves had hastened. The silence of this sorrowful scene was broken by a soft, almost inaudible rustle of huge, dense wings. From the empty north meadow, gliding between the mighty trunks of forest giants, 3 hippogriffs approached the white tree clearing. They did not fly, but walked with a proud, cautious tread, their taloned feet stepping silently on damp moss and faded foliage. One halted a few paces from the old priest and young druid, bowing its eagle head in a deep, mute, yet dignified obeisance. It was not a gesture of submission, but one of deep recognition and silent reverence for the last guardians of a vanishing home, for those who had given a part of their own soul to make this great and sorrowful exodus possible. No words, no explanations were needed. Quendelern slowly, with great effort, as if tearing his own roots from the tree, lifted his palm from the rough bark of the cracked tree. He met his weary, wise gaze with the steady gaze of the hippogriff and gave a barely perceptible, but clear nod. Talos, gathering the remnants of his strength, leaning heavily on his staff which responded with a weak gleam, took a step forward towards his winged guides on this final journey. The hippogriffs moved closer, their huge bodies, covered in glossy fur and feathers, radiating calm, animal warmth. They crouched on powerful, bent hind legs, lowering their chests to the very ground to ease mounting. Quendelern heaved himself up with the same stately, though weary, care with which he always settled onto his carved throne at the tree's foot, now replaced by this living, breathing creature. Talos arranged himself more simply, wrapping his arms around the strong, warm neck of the beast, his staff clutched tight in a white-knuckled hand, pulsing faintly, but persistently with muted green light, as if in rhythm with the steady, deep breathing of the hippogriff beneath him. And then they rose into the air, not with the sharp, swift descent of a predator, but with a smooth, almost sad, reluctant lift from the native, memory-soaked earth. Quendelern did not look back at the tree, at the crack that watched him go like a wound. His weary, sharp gaze was fixed forward and down, where among the trees the winding trail his people had taken could still be seen. But his thin, parchment-skinned hand involuntarily clenched a tuft of the thick, springy mane beneath him for a moment, feeling under his fingers the warm, living, strong beat of an alien yet loyal heart that had taken upon itself the burden of this final farewell. Talos, on the contrary, looked down at the diminishing, melting into green haze crowns of the sacred grove, at the empty, scarred meadow, and in his forest water-colored eyes shone not sentimental sorrow, but a quiet, sober, almost severe clarity. The duty was done. What was past. The forest had released them, and they no longer belonged to it, but had become part of another grim movement. The hippogriff leader, having fulfilled his mission as envoy, had not immediately flown off with his cadre, sending them to catch up to the main army. It had climbed high on a strong updraft born of sun-warmed rocks, and from there, at a respectful but distinct distance, observed as a whole, hitherto unseen aerial armada gather and set forth. The gray peaks, usually silent, stern, and impregnable as death itself, now stirred, moved, hummed with low vibrations. The assembled force of griffins was not merely numerous, it was frighteningly, overwhelmingly majestic. They did not crowd in disorder, did not jostle in the air like a flock of startled crows. On the contrary, from the moment of that low, stone-like hum of the lore, a clear, grim, almost soundless rhythm had established itself over the crags, subjugating all. The Lord of the Crags himself, colossal and dark, stood on the edge of the highest, bare peak, like an idol carved by wind and time from the very heart of the mountain, immobile, all-seeing, surveying his domain with a cold gaze of molten gold. His shadow, long and dense, fell upon the rocks below like a portent of storm. Beside him, on slightly lower but no less imposing ledges, the leaders of the flocks waited, similarly gigantic griffins, whose fur and feathers were streaked with the white scars of many battles, whose mighty beaks were notched and bent in clashes with cliffworms, and other foulness teeming in dark crevices. From each emanated a quiet, predatory might, the patience of carnivorous stone. They waited without moving, and only their eyes, as golden as their lords', with a different, more ferocious depth, slowly tracked the bustling life below. The air at this altitude was thin, cold, and ringing like a taut string. Each breath seared the lungs, each exhalation turned into a billowing puff of vapor, instantly torn apart by the wind. The Lord slowly, with stone-like inevitability, turned his huge, eagle head. His heavy, imperious, all-seeing gaze, devoid of any warmth, slid over each of the leaders, as if testing their readiness, checking the steel of their will. No words or cries were needed. That gaze itself was an order, clear and merciless as the law of gravity, and each leader, meeting that gaze, answered it, not with a roar, not a wing beat. They gave a short, sharp, mod-like bow, more akin to a headbutt, an ancient, primal gesture acknowledging authority and accepting the burden of command. It was a movement both simple and filled with deepest meaning, as if an entire oath of fealty were compressed into one instant. Having performed it, a leader would turn away, breaking the visual link with the ruler, and direct its attention downward, to its own sector of sky where its flock gathered in anxious, disciplined silence, clustering into dark, living clots. Young and old, with feathers the color of rusty iron and dark bronze, they waited, perched on ledges and outcrops, and in their immobility was felt the same gathered, pent-up power as in their chieftains. The air thrummed with the low, barely perceptible tension of thousands of muscles ready to explode into motion, and after a few moments began what resembled a majestic and terrible act of nature itself, the awakening of an ancient, pitiless order. This was no mechanism, it was a living embodiment of will, transferring from being to being like current through a chain. First rose the scouts. They detached from the main masses soundlessly, like shadows, their narrow, swift silhouettes darting forward into the gray pre-dawn haze over the mountain passes. Their task was simple, to scout the path, mark it for those who would follow, become the invisible eyes of the advancing armada. They vanished into the distance, dissolving into the cold haze. After them, in a heavy and inexorable wave, came the main force. They did not all take off at once, not in a disordered, mosey flock. The ascent occurred by the dozens, in trim, practiced two automatic rows. Each flock knew its place, each griffin its position, in formation. First, the younger, more agile ones pushed off from the stone, taking places on the flanks. Then, with a dull, air-rending hum like a distant rock slide, the more experienced rose, their bodies massive, scar-covered armors of flesh and feather. They formed into broad, dense, formidable wedges even in the air, immediately after leaving the crag, and these wedges, numbering up to 100 bodies, were like living battering rams, flying boulders that had suddenly gained wings, mind, and a single purpose. The sound of their ascent filled the gorges. It was not merely noise, it was a hum, low and powerful, seeming to emanate from the very breast of the mountains. The sound of thousands of mighty wings beating the cold air merged into one continuous, overwhelming roar that made dust tremble on the rocks and sent small stones clattering down. The air, already thin, seemed to thicken with this power, to vibrate, filling with the smell of sweated fur, hot breath, and cold stone. And at the center of this nascent hurricane, on his bare peak, remained the immobile Lord. He observed, his golden eyes, unblinking, followed each ascending squad, mentally marking it on an invisible map of the coming war existing only for him. In his immobility was not inaction, it was focus, cold like a spring, like a hammer poised to strike. He was the soul of this awakening, its quiet, all-seeing center from which emanated the iron will that turned hundreds of proud, wild loners into a single, perfect instrument of war. Each wingbeat below was an echo of his silent command. Each formed wedge an embodiment of his calculation. This was no mechanism, but a manifestation of supreme, predatory organization, terrible in its flawless simplicity and inexorable force. In this ringing, mountain silence, a new sound arose, not a bass hum or the grating of beaks, but the soft, resilient, familiar beat of large wings. From a lower ledge, where it had waited all this time with patient immobility, rose that hippogriff leader. It did not dash off to catch up with the departing griffin wedges. Instead, it described a wide, respectful circle, etching a full circumference in the air, and smoothly, without haste, flew to the very foot of the peak, halting in the air at the same level as the Lord, but at a respectful, deferential distance, sufficient not to be perceived as a threat. Two lords of the sky, one born from the fury of stone and storm, the other from the nobility of free plains and high flight, faced each other, frozen in the thin air. They exchanged no battle cry, no brief nod. They simply met each other's gaze, and that was enough. In the golden, unblinking eyes of the griffin was a cold, predatory, ancient certainty and an absolute, total readiness for what must come to pass. In the amber, clear eyes of the hippogriff the same inexorable clarity, the same deep understanding of duty and role, supported by a silent, genuine respect for the brute force and ancient, unwritten law of the mountains that the being before him embodied. This silent look lasted but a single instant, yet within it was contained, compressed, the entire meaning of their fragile, forced alliance, mutual recognition of alien natures, an unbreakable pact sealed not by parchment but by shared thread, and a common, terrible goal for which their worlds had converged on this windswept ledge. Then the Lord of the Crags, slowly, with stately heaviness, spread his colossal, dark wings, dark as night stone, every feather, every tendon, every muscle beneath the dense hide tensed, filling with a wild, centuries-dormant strength that was about to be unleashed. He did not leap from the ledge, he pushed off powerfully, deliberately, with all for pause, and in that moment it seemed the very mountain shuddered briefly, seeing off its true master. His ascent was heavy, stately, full of inexorable, overwhelming might, like the movement of an age-old glacier beginning its unstoppable slide into a valley. The hippogriff leader, having held another second of deference, responded with its own, utterly different movement. Its ascent was different, swift, springy, full of innate, aristocratic grace and precision. It did not try to match the colossus in brute force. It found its own convenient air current and soared upward lightly, almost soundlessly, only a slight whistle of parted wing, to take its allotted place in this new, fate-approaching hierarchy. Two winged, majestic silhouettes, so unlike in form and essence, merged with the thick pre-dawn gloom, carrying away in their hearts the last, now useless doubts. The Lord, a huge, dark thundercloud drifting with the unhurried dignity of the most inevitable doom, and the hippogriff leader, a swift shadow of bronze and steel gliding alongside. They did not fly in formation like the other griffins. They moved in unison of a different, higher order, to monarchs, to sovereigns, setting forth to one great field of battle, gaining altitude and leaving far below the empty, silent, now alien gray peaks, resembling the cooled coals of a giant bonfire. Ahead lay the pass, the elf army that was likely already pitching its first March camp at its cold foothills, and the eternal darkness creeping from the east. The terrible land final game was beginning. All pieces, from pawn to king, were set upon a board half the size of the world. Now remained only to make the first, irrevocable move, after which there would be no way back. 3 days passed. 3 long, excruciating days of forced waiting and preparation at the very foot of the stone giant, the grim dragon's spine, whose peaks, crowned with eternal snows, stabbed into the low, gray sky like the rotten teeth of a titan. Here, on a foothill plain covered in tough, brown grass, lay Landorn's last camp before the final leap. It was far smaller, tighter, and more austere than its great predecessor. The white tree. This was no place for a long, settled stay, but a temporary, harsh staging ground before a desperate jump into the depths of the sky. Tents of coarse canvas stood in tight, crowded rows. Wagons were arrayed in neat, geometric squares, ready for lightning-fast loading at the first signal. In the air, saturated with the scent of pine from nearby slopes, the depth of a stream, and the cold, motionless breath of the mountain stone itself, hung now not a nervous, feverish tension of preparation, but a concentrated, almost prayerful, deep readiness, like a bowstring drawn before releasing an arrow. And above all this camp, on the steep, sheer cliffs and impregnable ledges, new masters of this sky had settled. Griffins and hippogriffs kept apart, each flock on its own, long-chosen heights, observing an invisible but palpable distance. The griffins, true to their nature as masters of the crags, occupied the highest, bare, wine-scoured rocks, offering a clear, palm-of-the-hand view in all four directions. They sat or lay immobile, like statues, their dark, almost black silhouettes blending with the color of stone, only occasionally turning their mighty, deep heads slowly, with heavy smoothness, scanning the horizon with their golden, unblinking eyes. Their silent presence was felt by the elves below as a heavy, mute, physical pressure, not hostile, but deeply alien, an ancient, elemental force bound only temporarily by treaty and shared peril. Lower, on more sloping ledges covered with sparse mountain grass and small rocky meadows, the hippogriffs had settled. They were more noticeable, more mobile, closer to the earth and their elf allies. Some preened their glossy feathers with their beaks, others quietly, in half-voices, communicated with low, guttural but soft sounds. They formed a living, vigilant, yet connective perimeter between the human-like camp of the elves and the unapproachable, aloof heights of the griffins, being the natural bridge, the link between to such different worlds. Gwendolyn and Talos, having arrived on their winged mounts, settled in the very center of the camp by a small, hastily assembled field altar of stones brought from the foothills, where now smoldered a handful of sacred ash from Landorn. They spoke little to each other, conserving strength and awaiting the arrival of their new, final allies. Their work now consisted not in active action, but in patient, stoic presence, in maintaining the subtle, invisible link with earth and sky established by the ritual at the White Tree. And then, as the third long day waned and the sun, cold and pale, began to dip towards the sharp, jagged peaks, staining them bloody crimson, from the south, from beyond the dark line of distant forest, came the cry at last. But this was no mere bird cry or beast call. It was a signal, a sharp, staccato, piercing shriek. And it came not from empty sky. From beyond the far, southern borders of the dark forest emerged and raced towards the camp at breakneck speed, a small, but distinct dark speck. And behind it, still very far away, at the very seam of sky and horizon, something else, far more vast, began to manifest, to gain reality, not a speck, but a whole, wide wall, a vague, gray, shimmering band slowly, inexorably stretching across the entire southern edge of the firmament, as if the thick, eternal fog of the misty lowlands itself had stirred and crawled north, fulfilling its duty. The griffin, not slackening its furious speed, cutting the air with a hum, shot right over the very camp, its sharp wings tearing the air with a dry, cracking sound like a whiplash. It did not land, did not seek its leader. Instead, making one steep, almost vertical turn, it sped back again, without slowing, towards the approaching, growing with every second gray wall. The entire camp, from the youngest elf to Gwendolyn himself, froze, fixing thousands of gazes southward. Elves ceased all movement. Griffins on the cliffs, even the usually restless hippogriffs, all silently, holding their breath, watched as the gray, living band on the horizon grew, darkened, acquired clear, terrifying form. These were not clouds or mirage. These were hundreds, thousands of silhouettes, colossal, narrow, deathly sharp wings moving in a strange, almost somnambulant, measured rhythm, without haste, without visible effort, as if they swam on an invisible, mighty river. They flew low, heavily, their broad, densely feathered bodies barely swaying in the air currents, making their movement seem even more weighty. No words were needed. The spectacle spoke for itself louder than any sound. Lirael, standing at the very edge of the camp on a small rise, felt a cold, icy wave of profoundest relief and simultaneous primordial awe before the power of nature run down her spine, making her heart still. She slowly turned and met Talos' gaze across the distance of the camp. The druid stood leaning on his staff, his pale, weary face turned south. He did not smile, showed no joy. He simply looked, stared, and in his wide-open eyes, drinking in all the sunset light, was reflected, as into dark lakes, the approaching wonder of a promise fulfilled. Flying towards them all, vast and silent. "The hawks," she said simply, without emotion, and her quiet but clear voice sounded in the universal hush louder than any battle cry or trumpet call. That one word, that acknowledgement, was enough. As if by the wave of an invisible, all-powerful hand, the entire camp exploded into the final, polished to automatic activity. The concentrated, frozen readiness change in an instant to immediate, precise, calibrated action. Commanders rushed to their formed-up squads, issuing already rehearsed, dagger-short commands. Some elves began preparing the heavy, cumbersome packs of gear and supplies for loading. Others, more agile, swiftly cleared special areas, readied stout ropes and reliable lashings for cargo. The sudden, animated jingle of buckles, thud of discarded weapons, muted but quick, clipped voices merged into a single, powerful, purposeful hum of an anthill awakening for its final surge. The preparation for the airlift, for the great leap over the mountains, had begun. Gwendolyn slowly, with a quiet creak of joints, rose from the journey stone he sat upon. His old, weary gaze slid from the approaching, sky-eclipsing aerial armada to the seat-in, bustling camp, then slowly moved towards the immobile, cliff-like figure of the Lord of the Crags, still enthroned on his stone perch. The old priest clearly saw how the Griffins, until then motionless on the crags, one by one, as if animated by the touch of invisible force, rose on their powerful paws, slowly spreading their huge, dark wings, and in their movements was now not patient readiness, but a gathered intent for action. Their time of silent, stone-like waiting was over. Now began their true work, the work of living. Aerial transport, a giant living bridge between solid earth and filling sky. Lirael, having given Aylar her last, clear instructions for organizing the loading, momentarily tore her gaze from the approaching wall of hawks and looked up at the sullen, snow-capped, seemingly eternal peaks of the dragon's spine, whose shadows now lay across the entire plain. Somewhere there, beyond these stone masses, in the dark, deep bowels of the mountains, the dwarves of Nar-Uzdum-Arak already waited, and from the east, from where the crimson beam had shone, darkness surely already crawled, stirring, ready to erase and devour all life. But now, for the first time in many weeks of despair, they had not just a chance, but a tangible possibility. A chance sailing towards them on hundreds of soundless, impossibly mighty wings, ready to accept upon their broad backs the entire weight of their last hope, and all their steel weaponry. What began in the camp in the following minutes resembled not the usual, fussy loading of wagons, but a strange, majestic, and silent ritual performed by titans, whose nature and purpose remained a mystery to the mortals forced to observe from below. Instead of expected chaos and rumble, a silence reigned, tense and ringing, broken only by the rustle of wind in the gorges and the loud thud of one's own heart. In every elf's ears, the hawks, to everyone's astonishment, did not land on solid ground, did not settle their heavy, seemingly sculpted from whole cliffs bodies upon it. They'd, like enormous, imperturbable aerial ships from another, older world, sailed to the very foot of the cliffs and hung in the air, forming a living, slowly undulating, multi-tiered pier, a floating harbor not found on any sea chart. Their colossal wings, long and broad with feathers the color of storm ash and frozen lava, barely stirred, only the tips of the flight feathers, thin and hard as blades, made barely perceptible, measured beats tiny corrections sufficient to hold the massive bodies unstable, almost motionless, hovering at the height of an old, centuries-old oak. They hung in the air utterly without sound, and this silence was terrifying, for it defied all familiar laws of flight. Their huge, round, dark eyes, deep as bottomless forest lakes on a moonless night, looked somewhere through the bustle below, indifferently and detachedly. It seemed they observed not the scurrying of small, busy creatures, but the invisible, yet well-known to them currents and streams of air, reading them like a map. And this unseen river was henceforth their only element and road. And it was to this hovering, living key, to this ghostly pier, that all the organized, fine-tuned activity of the elves now streamed. The work, a moment ago seeming chaotic, suddenly acquired strict, calibrated order. The heavy, coarse hidebound pack smelling of smoke and sweat, the tarred water barrels and sacks of dried provisions, unloaded from wagons, were no longer dragged over uneven ground. The elves, silent and focused, lifted them using long, hand-polished ash poles and flexible, tightly woven rope nets sewn from hemp fibers. That the truly titanic work was done not by them. From above, from the grim ledges and bare crags, descended the Griffins to where the hawks hung. They acted with stony, unerring, frighteningly soulless efficiency. They did not land on the ground, did not waste time on landing and extra movements. No, the powerful, brown fur, and bronze-feathered giants stuffed down, snatching the prepared cargo directly in flight, on the wing. What several elves could not shift, their mighty, clenched iron talon paws lifted easily, almost carelessly. They deftly grasped the prepared nets and slings, sensing weight and balance with the instinct of an old warrior feeling his sword. With a dull, elastic, horizon-filling hum of huge, battle-dracker sail-like wings, the cargo tore from the earth. Stones pressed by it lifted slightly and fell again, as if sighing in relief. And this cargo, be it a crate of arrows, a water barrel, or a rolled canvas tent, was carried through the air with jeweler's precision, placing a precious stone in its setting, and carefully, without a single jolt, laid upon the broad, flat, ocean ship deck-like backs of the hovering birds. The hawk seemed not even to notice the added weight. They merely sank slightly, almost imperceptibly to the human eye, deeper into the air. Accepting the new burden, their mighty breast muscles beneath the thick hide tensed for a moment, and then they froze again, patiently and impassively awaiting the next portion, like age-old crags accepting another layer of snow. It was a giant, almost silent conveyor, calibrated not by elves, but by nature and desperation for this one incredible purpose. The griffins served as living, thinking, tireless cranes born of mountain fury. The hawks were the immobile, infinitely patient cargo platforms come from the realm of mists and silence. The elves on the ground below became the clear and swift dispatchers, their gestures honed, economical, replacing any shouts or orders, indicating what, where, and in what sequence to move. No unnecessary sounds, no fuss or jostling, only the continuous, low, sleeping dragon breath-like rumble of many wings of griffins, descending and ascending, and the barely perceptible rustle of the hawk's wings, the creak of taut, palm-burning ropes under the weight of packs, the measured, dull, visceral thud of wooden crates being laid upon dense feather, the clank of weapons being secured. The air, cold and transparent, filled with a mixture of smells, pungent resin, sun-sweated leather, cold, oily iron of blades and arrowheads, and an unearthly, faintly sweet, dusty aroma emanating from the hawk's own feathers. It was the smell of distant, inaccessible fogs, of high-altitude winds, and of something ancient, woody, like the memory of primeval forests long gone. Lirael watched this giant act for several long minutes, standing apart like a captain assessing the readiness of her unusual fleet before sailing. Her cold, analytical, illusion-free mind impartially evaluated the pace and coordination, calculating like an accountant the approximate time until loading was complete, correlating it with the pulsating crimson glare to the east that flickered at her back. Like a reminder of fate's ticking clock, she saw Aelor giving short, head nod directions to his fighters, Orlin assessing the stowage with a glance, Lirael and Iviel helping organize the transfer of field apothecaries, their concentrated, tail faces. Then her gaze, firm and unhurried, returned to the hawks, to these living ships, and she gave a brief, almost imperceptible nod, as if agreeing with an unspoken thought. She turned to her own company, gathered nearby in the shadow of a huge boulder, to these elves whose faces she knew like her own, thoughts, whose wounds and fears were her wounds and fears. Their path, the path of the most experienced warriors, those who must arrive first and prepare everything for the rest, laid differently. They did not have to wait their turn in this majestic but slow queue of titans. They had their own, faster and more familiar transport, and their own, special mission, on which too much now depended. At the very edge of the camp, on a specially leveled rocky area, their mounts already waited. Unmoving hippogriffs. Not all, of course, but only the chosen, strongest, hardiest, and most experienced of the entire flock, those already accustomed to riders and unafraid of them, whose backs remembered the weight and movements of a specific elf, and in whose eyes was read not the patience of a servant, but the silent accord of a partner. The leader stood at the very center of this select group, his powerful, gleaming form in the last slanting rays of the setting sun like a magnificent statue cast of pure, warm bronze and dark, cold steel. Every feather on his chest and mighty haunches gleamed with copper. Every muscle beneath the sleek hide was visible in moments of tension, as he shifted weight from foot to foot, a movement full of restrained strength, like a mighty predator aware of its superiority. Beside him, slightly apart, his most tested and reliable kin stood arrayed in a loose but understowed order, similarly majestic, slightly smaller in stature, but not in spirit, with manes the color of autumn foliage and old gold coins, with beaks marked by scars of past skirmishes. They waited, and in their immobility was the very essence of readiness. The silence before a long leap into the unknown. Lirael, unhurriedly, approached him, this leader. Her steps on the fine gravel were quiet but firm. The hippogriff, catching her familiar scent, a blend of forest, leather, sweat, and that unyielding wool that emanated from her like heat from stone, inclined its large, intelligent head, its curved, deadly beak, marked by a characteristic old scar like a lightning bolt dried upon it, almost touched her shoulder in that same gesture which between them was more eloquent than any oath. Complete, deepest trust, fortune shared flights and silent glances exchanged over maps. She raised a hand and laid her palm on his warm, smooth-feathered neck, feeling beneath it the calm, powerful, steady pulse of life, the beat of a huge heart that thumped in unison with the rising excitement in her own chest. The skin beneath the feathers was hot, alive, and this warmth penetrated through the skin of her palm straight into her blood, warming and calming. "The last leg, my friend," she said softly, almost a whisper, more to herself than to him, looking somewhere past his head at the darkening mountain teeth. But the beast seemed to understand. It tilted its head slightly, its amber eye, intelligent and perceptive, flashing in the last sun ray, and in it was read not mere obedience, but agreement, understanding of the full gravity of the moment. It was the look of a comrade in arms. Gathering herself, she deftly, using the protrusion of its bent articulated foreleg as a foothold, scrambled onto its broad, muscular back covered with shorter, stiffer feathers. The elf found the familiar, body memory marked place between the shoulder blades, where the rhythm of its movements transmitted to her most fully and balance was easiest to maintain. Her fingers instinctively gripped the thick, springy mane growing at its withers, and her legs wrapped tightly around its warm flanks. Nearby, with the same mute, practiced to automatic precision, Aylar heaved himself onto the back of his hippogriff as grin and silent as himself. No superfluous movements, no fuss, only a brief glance with which the sentinel checked the fastening of his sword on his back, and the position of his bow. Orlin, having finished a final check of his light spear secured in a shoulder loop, silently nodded to Lirael. His face, usually animated with scout's curiosity, was now stone mask of readiness. Iviel and Rinel were already settling on their mounts, their movements slightly less assured but just as determined, and the faces of all beneath their traveling cloak hoods were pale as linen, but lips were tightly compressed, eyes burning with the hard, cold fire of duty. Even Lirael, whose icy, detached mask seemed carved from the same granite as the statues in the ancient halls of Nar-Uzdum-Arak, climbed onto her hippogriff's back with polished, almost lifeless grace, as if her body remembered movements the mind had long since rejected. Talos and Gwendolyn approached last, slowly, carefully, like two old, exhausted trees moved by a final gust of wind. For them, two of the calmest, most patient, and enduring hippogriffs had been chosen, whose tread on the ground was particularly smooth and whose temperament was as gentle as that of old workhorses. Meanwhile in the sky, having completed their primary, titanic work of loading, the Griffins rose higher, one after another, with heavy, powerful wing beats. They did not fly away. They took up predetermined positions for aerial escort, as if placed on an invisible chessboard. They were to become the living, grim, merciless shield for this vulnerable, slow, yet vitally important, armada on the long and perilous journey over the snow-capped mountain ranges. They dispersed into wedges and rings at different altitudes, their dark silhouettes against the evening blue becoming part of the landscape, stern and inexorable as fate itself. Lirael, already seated on the leader's back, cast a final glance over the embarkation area, this last patch of solid earth soon to be left behind. She saw the last elf, pale with strain, settling on his hawk's back, finding purchase in the thick plumage, securely wrapping prepared leather straps sewn to a special broad surcingle around his wrists. There were no saddles, no bridles, only mutual trust, tenacious fingers, and the will to hold on. And when that last warrior froze, pressing into the feathers, she knew, inwardly, with her whole being, that everything was finally ready. Ready was not just the entire army of Landorn, but the age-old will of her people, all the defenders of the forest, from the last youth who had just taken up about to the gray-haired high priest, who had seen the dawns and dusks of entire epochs. They were ready to enter their final, mortal struggle not for lands or treasures, but for the very breath of life, shoulder to shoulder with those allies already waiting for them in the stone-hewn halls of Nar-Uzdum-Arak. Lirael raised her head and met the gaze of the hippogriff leader, who seemed only to have awaited this moment, this silent signal, without turning, as if sensing her thought through skin and muscle. It slowly, with incredible, royal creature dignity, nodded its eagle head, deep in its amber. Intelligent, I flashed not a spark, but a whole flame of understanding of the path, the danger, and the role that had fallen to them both. Then, without a warning cry, without an extra flourish, it thrust powerfully, with its whole being, away from the ground. Mighty hindhooves straightened like titanic springs, breast muscles bulged beneath the feathers, and it soared into the air with a lightness that seemed impossible for its size. And behind it, as if by an invisible but iron command, rose one after another, with the same synchronized, practiced motion, all the other hippogriffs with their elven riders. The air filled with the hum of dozens of large wings, the dry clapping like the tearing of dense fabric, and then Lirael, tearing away from the solid, native, wormwood and smoke-smelling earth, saw for the last time below the rapidly shrinking, emptied, and now truly silent camp. Discarded, toll-like wagons stood as useless cubes, dying campfires smolder as tiny red dots, and the distant, motionless figures of griffins on the highest crag seemed carved from the very stone, part of the mountain landscape left behind. Before her, around her, opened and took her breath away the panorama of an incredible, impossible, and dread spectacle. Hundreds of hawks, loaded to the very limit so that their broad, gray-feathered sides almost touched one another, hung in the evening, last light-shot air. They were like a giant, ghostly fleet of bizarre dirigibles ready to sail, the woven not of matter but of living flesh, strong bone, and dense feather. They swayed on invisible airwaves, making their mass seem even more monumental. And above them, higher still in the cold, darkening blue, hung, like thunderclouds before the strike, the dark, honed wedges of griffins. They waited only for the signal to surge forward, clearing the path, becoming a living battering ram against any threat. The signal, as befitted this new, strange alliance, was given by the Lord of the Crags himself, and from the height of his peak rolled the low, drawn-out, now familiar hum from the muster at the gray peaks. It rolled across the frozen, thousand-heart rhythm-filled air not as a furious battle cry, but like the first, distant, bass rumble of thunder heralding not mere rain, but a great storm. It was not a request or summons. It was a precise, brooking no argument, cast from authority and stone command to begin the great movement. And the entire colossal, living armada, this fellowship of feather, claw, and will, stirred into motion, slowly, incredibly slowly, with the stately, unhurried solemnity belonging only to the grandest natural phenomena. The hawks, guided by some inner, flock instinct, began to turn their heavy, sea-ship hull-like bodies. Their movement was not the swift flight of a predator spotting prey, but a majestic, inexorable drift like the flow of a deep and mighty river. They gained altitude, rising towards the dark pass yawning ahead like a gate to another world. The hippogriffs with elves on their backs flew ahead of this giant aerial caravan, their sharp, elegant, hidden powerful silhouettes a striking contrast to the massive, ponderous, yet infinitely reliable giant bearers. And highest of all, at the very limit of visibility, where the air was already thin, cold, and ringing, hung the griffins, having absorbed the last light of the departed day. They were like dark, ready at any moment to crash down clouds. A stone rain of claws and beaks meant to tear to shreds any winged obstacle. On the path of this last, desperate march of an entire people, the earth with its firm, familiar every route and trail paths and reliable forest shelters beneath the ancient oak canopies, was left far behind, turning into a dark, deeply wrinkled with gorges carpet somewhere in the impenetrable depth below. Now their fate the fate of all Landorn, its songs, its memory, its ancient roots, and indeed all their strange, forced allies sailed with them in the thin, searingly cold air high in the mountains. It rested not on anything tangible, but upon the broad, silent backs of alien colossi, whose thoughts were as dark and inscrutable as the depths of the gorges over which they flew. And this fate was under the guard of winged predators, whose golden eyes saw in them not brothers in arms, but part of a landscape to be protected. The path through the sky, this last, desperate leap over the edge of the familiar world, had begun. And back, as Lirael understood with her whole being, there was no road neither for her, nor for anyone. And as if an invisible, curse-weighted hand were prodding her, that same cursed flare raised for a few moments in the east, was felt on the skin like pressure, before a storm, squeezing the temples and drying the mouth. It pulsed in her blood, behind her eyes, with a cold, relentless, obsessive rhythm, as if a second, alien heartbeat within her body, counting down every stolen second from them, from the elves. From all living things until the inevitable land final catastrophe, each heavy beat of the huge, sail-like wings of the hawks, swimming somewhere far behind with the main army and its hopes, now seemed to her unbearably slow, almost criminal in its deliberation. The mountain seemed to her not landmarks, not waypoints, but countless, soulless barriers. Thieves stealing precious, last time those hours, or perhaps minutes, that might separate phantom victory from complete and irrevocable annihilation of all she knew and loved. Faster, the thought, sharp and cutting from within, escaped as a short, sharp, barely audible sigh, taking the last warm, still grass-scented air from her chest. She leaned forward, almost pressing her lips to the warm, smooth-feathered neck of her hippogriff, beneath her thighs, gripping its body, tensed and rippled, rolling under the skin, mighty, taut as ship cable muscles. She felt the beast's breathing quicken and deepen, its heartbeat accelerate, responding to her involuntary pressure with her legs and tight grip on the mane. "We must be there before them. We must make it in time," she whispered now into the mane, and the words were addressed not to anyone, but to the universe itself, to the merciless laws of time and distance. Her company, the small handful of elves on an equally small handful of hippogriffs, caught up in this silent yet tangible, electric shock-like will of their leader, instinctively picked up the pace, as if they all, people and beasts, were bound by a single invisible, but strongest thread of common intent. The hippogriffs, created by nature not for freight hauling but for swift speed, for fierce dashes and sharp, deadly maneuvers, easily, almost playfully, with a sudden surge of hidden strength, pulled away from the droning, unwieldy, prehistoric elephant herd-like armada. It sailed behind on its unhurried, stately course, and this contrast between its sluggishness and their dash was agonizing. The leader, flying slightly ahead and higher, like the point of a spear, turned its eagle head for only a moment. Its piercing amber gaze, cold and assessing, slid over the receding, dissolving in purple dusk silhouettes of the hawks and the immobile, black obsidian cut-out figures of the griffins frozen high in the sky. It gave a short, guttural, approving cough-like sound, not an order to subordinates, but a silent, full of understanding agreement with its rider's intent. And immediately the rhythm of its huge, bronze wings quickened, became sharper, more energetic, almost fierce. Each stroke now beat the air with a dry, cracking sound, tearing it, striving to wring out maximum speed. Thank you for your attention. Please like and subscribe so you don't miss the next part and chapter.